Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, where God is at work, a podcast where cross-cultural workers discuss everything from faith and fear to finances and faux pas. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauly, a missions leader serving in Rome, and I'm here with Jenn Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. And yes, I left out our dear friend Alessandro De Leonardo, who is usually with us, but today he's busy gallivanting around the world or hosting people. Who knows what he's up to today? We'll hear from him next time. But thank you for tuning in and listening to Going. We're excited to get into our discussion today. Jenn, how are you doing? How's this week been for you?
It's been a good week. It's been a successful week in the sense that I found an apartment. So my husband and I have to move. The apartment we currently live in, which we've lived in for 8 years, is being sold.
Ah,
And we had wanted to buy it, but that didn't work out. So we have to move. And apartment hunting and finding apartments in Europe is, well, at least in France, is a challenge, especially when you're a foreigner.
yes. It is. It is for us too down in Italy, or I should say specifically Rome. But yeah, what makes it so challenging for you guys up in France? Is it the price or?
Price seems okay to me. People are really hesitant to rent to foreigners, and I kind of understand that. One, the law in France is definitely on the side of the renter. So once you
Mm,
have someone in your place renting it, it's really hard to get them out if you have a renter that isn't paying or that isn't, doing what they're supposed to be doing. The other reason is our income, both David and I, our income comes from the States. And so what that means is if we default on a payment, they really don't have any access or recourse on our salaries. They can't
oh
garnish your
yeah.
wages. Like there is a higher level of risk associated with renting to foreigners. So although, we're only applying for apartments that fit well within our budget, we've been refused for already one. So last week I put in another application, and often they want you to have a cosigner, even if you have, your budget is fine and you've sent them all the proof of your taxes and all your pay stubs and all of this, they still want a cosigner. And that's also hard as a foreigner to have someone who can co-sign for you. That's a national, that's what they want, someone whose income is guaranteed here. So anyways, we found an apartment that we like. My husband's deployed, so I had to find the apartment. This is kind of tricky. He did all the online looking because that's like a big dark rabbit hole for me of going through real estate listings. I could lose a day there. So when he's deployed, sometimes he's flying and some days he's not flying. And when he's not flying, he can do this stuff. So he would research, then he'd send me the ones that look interesting to him. Then I would make appointments to go look at the ones that seemed interesting to me of the ones that looked interesting to him. And so anyways, we found an apartment and it feels like a great big win. So
Oh, that's good.
that's good news.
As you're describing it at first, I was thinking he just puts the plane in cruise control and just kind of like scrolls on his phone through ads or something.
No. Where he works, the phone has to be literally in a vault. So
I'm glad to hear that he's flying safe and not using his phone while he's flying. Yeah, we had a crazy week too. Our yeah, it's just been we have people here visiting, trying to check out is God calling them to serve him in Italy, and so that's part of our week. But then we
cool.
woke up yesterday and our daughter refused to walk. Like when she usually climbs out of bed and she walks and she would not put her foot down. And so we didn't know what happened. The day before she had been playing, jumping around with her friend and went to sleep. Everything was good. Wake up, she's not walking. So we found
Oh,
out.
that's
We took
scary.
her to the emergency room, which is a whole nother situation. Talk about yeah, like you're saying, living overseas and trying to rent an apartment. The difficulties living overseas and having small kids and having to go to the hospital is because we're like we
Yeah.
don't have grandparents that we can say, hey, can you watch our other son?
Right.
Or so it's like became a family affair. Everyone piles in and we all sit in the waiting room
Yep.
um and yeah, long story short, she's okay. They just think an infection, which this is a new thing I didn't know about, but an infection can move from like your respiratory system or whatever into like joints, and so they think it moved into her hip joint or knee joint, and so yeah, long story short,
Wow.
she has to stay off her leg for a week and see if she feels better and take some ibuprofen to get the inflammation down.
hmm Are you in Italian healthcare system?
It's a weird situation. So technically, no, like Monica and I aren't, but because our kids were born here, they like automatically put them into the healthcare system. So it's
Hmm.
kind of this weird gray area because we were under the understanding with our visas we're not allowed to. Um, but then when they were born, they just automatically mailed us a health card for
Hmm.
Sophia. So
Okay, that is
I went to
interesting.
actually, that's a
Okay.
kind of a funny story. So we had to take her to the hospital emergency room for another thing, which we're getting used to this now. Uh, I don't know. I thought it was going to be my son that would always be in the hospital. Anyways, she had to go to the hospital before, and I asked the lady as I was leaving, I was like, "So where do I go to pay?" And she said, "We are in Italy. You can just go home." And so I was like, "Oh,
I
thank
know,
you."
right? That was gonna be my next question. So what does an ER visit cost you in Italy? Because yeah, same in France. We are in the French system. So we are paying into it. But yeah, same thing. Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah, so that was kind of cool. But yeah, so it's like, we're living overseas, we're doing this, global work, cross-cultural workers, and we have everyday life stuff, and then we're supposed to try and figure out in the midst of that, how do we make disciples? How do we
Right.
expand God's kingdom? How do we be a part of
Yeah.
what he's calling us to do? So why don't we jump into that today? Um, that Let's tackle this big conversation of what is discipleship, what is evangelism, and at least hint at some things. We're going to do another episode where we'll go more in depth later on, but um, I think today, why don't we look at like this term, which is, I don't know if it's a fad or what, but it seems like lately there's this push or this emphasis on the idea of disciple making movements. There's been
Mm.
books written on it. There's lots of people that are waving the flag of DMM, as they're often referred to. And maybe we could kick it off. Just, I don't know, what's your experience? Kind of how were you introduced to this? And I can share kind of how mine.
So when we first came on the field 15 years ago, the big push was church planting. Everybody was doing church planting. And then that kind of morphed. And I would say that moved into disciple multiplication and disciple multiplication movements. And it's sort of one of those tricky things because what happened was we saw in places predominantly Asia and Southeast Asia and China and things like that. We saw these movements happening, right? There the gospel was moving and growing and being shared in unprecedented places and in unprecedented numbers were coming through and a lot of those numbers we don't even really know because it's this major organic, oftentimes underground movement going on. And so we had some mission researchers and some missionaries who were involved with that, notably Steve Smith and Ying Kai, who wrote the T for T book, that kind of thing. We're doing lots of training all over the world. But what happened is that they really went in and mostly just tried to study what happened. What happened? Why did the gospel move like wildfire through these parts of the world and what was happening? And if you ever went to one of their trainings, you would hear them say, "We are not promoting a model. We are just explaining, trying to understand what happened." But of course, where people see a success or what we deem as success, you get copycats. You get people who want to turn it into a model. They want to break it apart and say, okay, so A plus B plus C equaled, we saw D happen in China. So what was A, B, and C? And can we replicate it? And the challenge there is one, much of this is a movement of the spirit, which we have no control over,
Yeah.
first of all, right? If the Spirit of God moves in a place, you're going to see great and mighty things happen, regardless of what we do right or what we do wrong um, as believers and kingdom workers in those places. At the same time, are there things we should learn, should observe and try and learn? Sure. Absolutely. So there's this delicate tension because what I think we saw in a lot of mission organizations was this desire to say, okay, if we do what they did, then we'll get the results that they got.
Mm. And probably the numbers, or I think what was so like
Yeah,
astounding.
enthralling.
Yeah, like
Right.
you had these huge numbers because obviously, the idea of multiplication is that as more people, each person takes it on, you're, exponentially growing your group or whatever you're following.
Right. And it's inspirational. I think we should celebrate those things. But I know that in Europe, it has been depressing for some of my European colleagues because it seemed like there was this expectation, or even, some missionaries and mission agencies trying to sell this idea that if we do this, this will happen. And then they didn't see it. All their great efforts, all, the heart's desire, the eagerness to share the gospel, and it just didn't happen that way. And so there's reasons for that we can also talk about later when we get into some of the culture part of the discussion. But I think we just have to be really careful about thinking that God is ever going to give us a model,
Yeah.
or a one size fits all model, because I think what Jesus invites us to do is to follow him closely and to live in faithful obedience every minute of every day to what he asks us to do with every person that I come across, in every conversation that I have. And am I willing to be faithful in those small places, regardless of what numbers or results I see? And it's almost easier to package a model to say, okay, you do this, you use this tool, you do it in this way, you share the 4 fields, you do whatever they are.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do those things. I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Yeah.
Of course we should. Of course we can use those tools. They're great. We just have to be careful about trying to prescribe what the results will be.
Yeah, I think that the idea of that there's this silver bullet that's the way you just, that will get them all if you just do it the right way, say it the right way. It was interesting. So in Bible college, I really appreciated this about the university we went to. It's actually no longer in existence, but they were really good at just presenting all of the different kind of bents, whether it would be theologically or doctrinally. And then our director of intercultural studies, that focused on missions, he did the same thing. So he kind of gave us an experience where we could understand church planting or disciple making or missiology in all the different kind of perspectives. In fact, I had the unique opportunity of Yin Kai being in our city and sitting in a living room of people who were just asking him about his experience and stuff. And at the time, I didn't even fully understand the privilege that it was just to hear kind of from a guy like him. But yeah, and then when I got to the field, it was like that's what everyone's talking about. We're doing multiplication. We're doing multiplication, and so I was like, yeah, let's. I was drinking the Kool-Aid too. I was like, yes, let's do multiplication, and then I sat in a conference during, I think it was during COVID, if I'm not mistaken, with some Italian partners and others. It was a conference where they were talking about multiplication, and like I would say within about 15 to 30 minutes of the ending of the day-long conference, virtual conference, one of our Italian friends wrote an article just tearing apart this concept of multiplication given the context that we're in. And I was like, wow, that opened my eyes. Like, I wonder what, our Italian brothers and sisters have to say about some of these ideas. And then more recently, just trying to implement some of the ideas of Discovery Bible studies and things like that. And just realizing that in different, with different people groups, let me put it that way, with different people groups that we interact with in the city, we see different responses. And
Yeah.
so sometimes when I've worked with foreigners, whether they be refugees or international students, or I've seen a great response to using some of the principles and things that I learned through discipleship making movement trainings. But then more recently, I tried with an Italian woman, and it was like it was difficult. It was a little bit of I won't say a disaster, because for sure God was working in the midst of our conversation. But I think, or the perception I got, well, actually, let me backtrack real quick. Let's explain a little bit what the DBS method, which is often used by
Yep.
discipleship making
Discovery Bible
movements.
Study. Sure.
Yeah.
Can I just make one comment too on the movement?
Yes.
I think I think I think we have to be very careful, because Jesus did tell us to go and make disciples, disciple makers. But we've made it DMM, Disciple Multiplication Movements, and we've added this. We need to make disciples who make disciples, and I think that does become, as we follow Jesus, we can't help to testify to what he does in our life with those we love and those around us and our friends and our neighbors. And so I think that there is a sense that healthy disciples end up making disciples. But I think when we push from the beginning towards a movement, we can jump over a really important step, which is the becoming a disciple, a true-hearted follower of Jesus, and letting that be actually the motivation of that any multiplication or sharing or impetus I take to do a discovery Bible study, for example, is growing out of my walk with the King of Kings who has changed and transformed my life. And I'm eager to share that genuine good news because I'm experiencing and living out the redemption versus the goal of anyone coming to faith being able to articulate what that faith means and bring someone else along. The goal is that I would be transformed into the image of Christ and that I would join in his kingdom work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's helpful to think about too. And also the idea that, like, yeah, we're not, I, I think another thing to remind ourselves of is that the idea of disciple making movements is a good thing. It's just what you're saying is kind of you're challenging, how much do we have to say in the movement part of it, and how much is that something that happens as a outflowing of the Holy Spirit working in someone's life? And because the idea of discipleship making movements has a lot of benefit. It helps us stop thinking only about evangelism and getting a decision, but actually getting into the scriptures and discipling. And the idea too of, like, we're not just doing humanitarian good efforts out in the world, but we're trying to help people walk this journey of a spiritual. But within, there's many things that DMM tools and things that are out there. But one of the more, I would say one of the more popular, more famous used one is this idea of a discovery Bible study. And so there's story sets, or you take passages and different parables and different stories, and you just read them as part of a process of getting into the Bible with someone. And then you ask certain questions. And so there's like a framework of, how's your week? What are some highs and lows? Kind of read the scriptures, regurgitate it in your own words, fill in the gaps, read the scriptures again, get into, like, what are you learning about God from this? What are you learning about mankind? It's an inductive study. So you're asking
Mhm.
questions, you're getting, and then at the end, there's this idea of, who are you going to go tell this story to? Can you think of someone? And the idea is the following week you would do another study and you would ask them, how was it that you told this person? And so that component of trying to create movement, create the idea of going out, is there from the very beginning and as part of the structure. And I don't know about your experience, Jen, but, like, so I've only tried Discovery Bible Studies with people who were not yet believers. And I've always found that the last part of asking them who and if they shared this story with someone has always been, I've hesitated a lot. And then even when I've, like, built up the courage to go ahead and ask, like, I've found that they tend to not to um, share it as often. And yeah, what's your experience been like with that?
So I will say personally, it's been a good challenge for me to ask that question because I'm hesitant to ask it. And I have been surprised in the positive sense when I ask it sometimes that sometimes people do have someone in mind, like, oh, I want to tell this to my sister, or my mom is going through something. I think this might help her, or whatever. I'm always surprised that when I ask it, people have an answer. On the flip side, it always feels like a bit of a diversion, like I'm having this great conversation with someone and I can see maybe God at work in that person or moving, or I can sense that something's happening, and then it can feel like a left turn. Okay, now who are you going to tell this to? Um, it's sort of like there wasn't time for them to live it and experience it themselves. And I
Ah,
think then we can get to the place where testimony and evangelism becomes something to check off on the box to do this week versus a genuine overflowing of what God is doing in my life. That being said, I need the push. I sometimes need to ask myself in my, now we have growth groups with people who have become believers, and part of our thing in our growth group is we talk about when did you have the opportunity to witness this week. And when we say that, we don't mean tell somebody else how they need Jesus. We need
hmm,
just share with a friend what God's doing for us. How have I witnessed God at work in my life? And am I
hmm,
talking about that with those around me? And that often will lead to a conversation where someone might be curious about wow, you seem to have an interesting relationship with God, Jenn, or what do you mean when you say you pray, or whatever. But when I find that I need the push. So the question is good even for me in my accountability groups. We do ask that every week. With whom did you share what God's doing? And I think that's a good way for me to look at it, to just say, in my relationships, as I'm out and about in town, as I'm going to do pottery, or as I'm engaging with my neighbors, if God has done something good for me, am I talking about that, and am I sharing that experience? But is it genuine and coming out of from my real lived experience of God, or is it something I have to do this week, which makes it robotic and not necessarily genuine?
Is that growth group or people that in your situation, people that already made a
Right.
decision?
Right. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. In that phase of discipleship, which to me that's still ongoing discipleship, I think there's a place for it. And I think early on, it's okay to ask the question, but maybe in a genuine, not in a you need to do this week way, but in a hey, if this story has touched you or impacted you, one of the ways that it's helpful to solidify something that we're learning is to talk about it with someone else. So if there's someone you can think about this week to talk about that with, then take advantage of that opportunity, but look at it as an opportunity of you to go deeper in your understanding of what you're learning about God. And if God uses that to minister to someone else, then that's great.
Yeah, actually, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the idea that we should look at these things and understand the heart and the principles behind them, and not get wrapped up in the formula or the order, or well, maybe not the order, but the formula. Like you were saying earlier, it's not A plus B plus C plus D. It can also just be, letting not having to get too tied down to the actual study plan and the guideline of it. Yeah, I think as we're talking about this tool that I was introduced recently, we were both part of this discussion in I don't know what you want to call it. We got together with a group of other missionaries and talked about
It was a
discipleship
task
and
force, I think. Yeah.
task force. Yeah. And in that, one of the things that came up and was a part of the discussion was the idea of the Engel scale, which you're probably more familiar than I am on maybe the origin.
Well, I know that Engel is the guy who came up with it. It's named after the guy who invented it.
Yes.
It's not
Okay.
a scientific method, so to speak, but it's more of a sociological observation, I would describe it as. And we'll put a link to an Engel scale in the show notes so people can look at it. But do you want to describe it, Jesse?
Yeah, so what's nice about it is and what I really appreciated about it is it looks more at like a framework for the spiritual life of a person, and less and so it kind of starts, and there's kind of different versions of it you can find out there if you Google Engel scale, but we'll put one in that we've used, or we appreciate. And the idea of starting with someone who has no awareness of God, and then the next step up would be to have some awareness. A couple steps up would be to like decide to investigate Jesus. A few more steps up would be like to understand what does it mean to grasp the truths of Jesus, all the way up to finally, after having made a decision, having seen change in their life, having understood the basics of their faith, the idea of understanding what it means to be a disciplined believer and follow spiritual formation and follow Jesus's way of life, to then sharing their faith with others as an outpouring of all of that growth, all of that that's happened.
Yeah. My favorite thing about it, and I think in missions we're particularly guilty of this, is we can see faith as like this on and off proposition. Like someone's not a Christian and then they cross the line of faith and they are a Christian. And then I can check the box that says, okay, I saw someone baptized this month, and then move on, versus the Engel scale, which the if you look at that crossing the line of faith, the point where you decide, okay, I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm going to commit my life to this cause, I believe this is the truth, and I'm all in. That's the middle of the scale. That's not the end of the scale. And I also love that it's the middle of the scale. So if we start every conversation we have with every person we know with the do you want to follow Jesus type questions or type Bible studies, we're ignoring the fact that many of them aren't even ready to ask that question yet. They're asking the question of is there a God? So the Engel scale helps us also tailor our conversation to people given where they are on the scale. And it doesn't mean it's a different truth. It means that if you're explaining to to Sophia why she needs to eat her green beans at her age, it's different than what you might tell her when she's a teenager, and it's different what she's going to understand when she's an adult about vitamins and minerals
Yeah.
and all of those things, right? So you just like we do with children, or if in any time you're new in learning any sort of process. When I first went to learn pottery, they taught me sort of like what they call, the some 4 basic gestures. You center the clay, you poke a hole in the clay, you open it, and then you I don't know the words in English because I've learned pottery in French, but then you bring it up higher. There's probably really good technical terms in English. I don't know them. Um, but now that I've been doing it for a year and a half, I'm realizing, oh, there's like a million little mini steps in there, actually. A million different nuances that change whether the bottom's flat or rounded, that change, how thick the sides are going to, like, there's a million nuances in there, but they didn't start with that because I couldn't handle that. And so if we have one approach to the gospel and one way of sharing Jesus and one whatever, there might be you know, one layer of people group who's in that phase of their journey, their faith journey, that it will apply to, but we'll miss the target on everybody else.
I was recently, and maybe we'll get into this too, like as we think through how do we understand where someone is at, I was recently thinking about this and like the culture that someone's in, especially the religious history of that area, is going to play into this too. So like some people might actually be starting from no awareness of God. And I don't know if we want to equate that to atheism or not, but the idea of, no awareness of God. But like, for example, we're in a culture that is primarily Catholic. And so there's been, a history of a form of Christianity here for so long that there is, there's contact with Christians. There's an idea of God and Jesus and so forth. And so we're not starting from zero.
Right.
We're starting from, farther up the scale. And that then changes your approach, I think, in how you interact with someone, what tools you use to try and share the truth of the gospel with them.
Totally. And we come, Jesse, from really individualistic cultures where it's, I have decided to follow Jesus and it's an individual choice. But there are collective cultures, and that's biblical. That's not a right or wrong thing. But there's collective cultures where either a whole family decides together to move into faith or they don't. And so when we look at things like disciple multiplication movements, those happen often in collective societies. And so one of the reasons you see exponential growth is because whole people groups or clans or clusters of families are coming together to a place of faith and decision. And so that's going to change too. If we overlay the Engel scale with the cultural differences, that's going to nuance it even more.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually hadn't thought before of the idea of the collectivism playing into the exponential growth. But yeah, it would make sense. If you're a family of 5 and one person hears the gospel and it goes to the whole family immediately, like, and we see that in scriptures where it talks about his whole family came. I'm trying to remember the reference and it's not coming to me off the top of my head. So one of the experiences I had recently is I was trying this discovery Bible study method. And there's a woman that we know, and she was interested in, well, she's mostly interested in practicing her English. But then she found out that we were people of faith. And so she was also interested in that. And so she wanted to combine the two. And so she's like, can we talk about your faith in English? And so I said, yeah, why don't we do this thing? And I explained it to her, one thing that I like to do is a discovery Bible study with people. It's just an inductive study, yada, yada, yada. So she was game, and she came over to our home, and we started reading. We actually were going to read the creation narrative as the first time. But we get to a point where, as I'm kind of asking the questions, she kind of said, "What are you trying to say to me?" Like she just kind of interrupted the flow of the question. And she knew that the questions were like, we had talked about it plenty of 2 times actually before she actually came to our home. And so it was just kind of, that was a moment for me where I realized, okay, she's already knows there's awareness of God, awareness of who Jesus is, awareness of the Bible. She's more at the point of trying to investigate and
Right.
understand
Right.
the truth behind. And so it became very obvious to my wife and I that she's more interested in maybe an apologetic approach and trying to understand, why should I believe the Bible to be
Right.
a historical book and not just a fable? And what did Jesus actually, she believes in the historical figure of Jesus, but she didn't know if she believes in his deity or in his ascension. And so it's like, okay, that drastically changed now. We're realizing, okay, we need to change our approach. It's not a one size fits all, just start everyone with a Discovery Bible study. But in her case, we need to actually do something different. Do you have, do you have any stories of kind of where you've been helping someone along on their spiritual journey, or how you've
Yeah.
determined where someone's at and what tool
So
to
I'm in
use?
a Catholic country too, France. And one of the first people I discipled here, she was a strong Catholic. She had all of the intellectual assent to Jesus, um, was the Son of God. He died on the cross. He rose again. She had no intellectual objections, but she had zero relationship with God. There was no living indwelling of the Holy Spirit. There was no sense of, she had a moral compass for sure, but there wasn't a sense of being a part of a great, kingdom that has come to earth and that we are participating in and redeeming. And so I think this is another thing where, again, if we look at evangelism as just crossing the line of faith, I could have just written her off and, moved on to the next person. Okay, she believes. But what I saw in this woman was a growth in intimacy with Christ to the point where then she started talking to her grandchildren differently about who God is and who Jesus is and how we can know him and worship him and love him and be loved by him. And it changed her witness because it got into the place of behavior change. She was forgiving a daughter that had wronged her, and those children of that daughter could feel the difference in the relationship and could know something had changed. And so, yeah, one of the things that's what about the Engel scale, yeah, that I love is not just the diagnosis pre-faith, but recognizing that even after we've come to faith, this is a lifelong journey, and our role as kingdom workers is to do our best, not only ourselves to be continually moving closer and closer to God and being more and more transformed into the likeness of Christ, but helping others wherever they are on that scale to take that next step on that journey. On the other hand, my husband, who's a pilot and works with people who tend to be more atheist, and he has lots of friends that are down at one, and he's seen some movement from one to two, from there is no God to, okay, maybe there is something out there. Maybe there is a place for God. And if we look at culture as a whole, one of my favorite podcasts right now is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God by Justin Brierley. And he's a British theologian, sociologist who looks at major trends and is recognizing how a lot of former people who would identify as new atheists are beginning to reject that. It's almost a religion. But that belief system, because it falls short and it doesn't actually answer all of their questions in the way that they thought it would. And so there's a ultra also in England for sure, and I think a little bit in Europe, a cultural movement from that post enlightenment, we don't need God, and you know we can figure it all out for ourselves. Science, trying to set science opposed to religion or against God. There's a movement from that now to saying actually there might be room for both. And so I think we can look culturally too at where our nations or our cultures are on that scale.
Yeah. Wow. As you were saying that, the thing that's standing out to me is, I didn't put these pieces together, but yeah, I'm in Europe as well, obviously, and very post-Christian at this point. But I've had a conversation recently with a group of people, all shared their belief systems, and almost all of them were no longer Christian, but almost all of them had some sort of spirituality. And in their describing, there was a process of not believing in any spirituality too, to then believing in some spirituality, whether it be Buddhism or something. And so I would have to go back and talk to each person, but I wonder how much of that was a discontentment with atheism, where they realize, like, yeah, not happy with that. That's an interesting perspective. So yeah, we just wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about this, what we've seen with discipleship movements and share some of the stories of what we've walked through with people. But we will be doing a podcast episode later where we're going to dive in a little bit more specifically to some tools and hopefully have some more practical helps for people. If I could summarize what we're trying to say is, in all things, there's probably some good principles that we can use and we can implement. And the idea is we want to be doing missions with God and with the Holy Spirit that's moving. And so part of that is not being too tied to our tools, but being open to where the Spirit's leading us, where God's working, and then pressing into that and trying to discern what principle, what tool would be best used. Instead of taking a hammer to everything, sometimes we need a screwdriver, sometimes we need a crowbar, and so let's try and be sensitive and not tied to our favorite tool. Well, thank you, Jenn, so much for your time and for the work you put into this study and helping all us who are global workers. I want to correct one of my outros, or all of my outros, and it's been brought to our attention that it is not a like and subscribe. That's a YouTube terminology. Actually, we're on podcasts on Spotify, and so would you please click follow and follow us, and then you can rate us. So you're not liking, but you're rating. We would appreciate a 5-star rating, but we want you to be honest. So whatever you want to give us as a rating. And shout out to my wife, Monica, for reminding me that I've been misspeaking that. I do also want to remind you that in the Spotify app, you can click on the episode and then there's a Q&A option. And in that Q&A, you can voice record or type in a question, and then we'll go ahead and either play it in the podcast or respond just to the written question as part of the as part of our interactions during an episode. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to talking to you on the next one.